IQ testing is one of the most ubiquitously encountered applications of psychology, but it's also been one of the most misused. So pretty soon after Simon and Binet came up with the idea of standardized testing, they could observe that some kids answered more questions than other kids their same age. And they decided to, well, turn that into a number. You know, how can we reflect how many fewer questions someone answers correctly relative to other 8-year-olds or relative to other 7-year-olds? Pretty soon after that, though, the United States government decided, oh, we can do other things with that other than just identify kids who are struggling in school. Maybe we can use that to identify soldiers in World War I that would be particularly trainable. Maybe we can use that to identify certain regions of the world where we would limit immigration by virtue of arguing that they are less intelligent than native-born Americans. And even in Virginia and Texas and California and other places, they even used IQ testing to justify involuntarily sterilizing women on the basis of their allegedly low IQ. This was the basis of a really infamous 1920s Supreme Court case called Vuck v. Bell, where they decided that on the basis of intelligence that they could rob women of their reproductive autonomy. So there's these horrible misuses of intelligence testing, and almost all of them were based on this really pernicious kind of evil myth, and that's the idea that intelligence is a fixed biological quantity of a person, something that you're born with. And that's not true. I'm a behavior geneticist. I study genetic influences on behavior, and it's certainly true that your biology can contribute to how you perform on different intelligence tests. But we also know from decades of research that intelligence is influenced by the environment and that it's malleable. And we see that in all sorts of different ways. So for instance, we know that when countries started making their students go to school longer, now you have to stay in school until you're 18 versus 14. When we made schooling more universal, intelligence test scores increased. When poor children are adopted into higher income homes, their intelligence test scores increase, or adopted out of orphanages. We see that if people are exposed to toxins like lead, suffer from malnutrition, or even have iodine deficiency, you might have ever noticed that your salt has iodine added to it, and that's because iodine deficiency can lower IQ. And then we also see this really curious thing called the Flynn effect. I noted that people's intelligence test scores are getting higher with every progressive generation. So your intelligence test scores are higher on average than your parents, than your grandparents. Part of that is because there's less lead in the atmosphere. Part of that is because you have better nutrition as a child, more universal access to healthcare. But also it's because you're exposed to certain sorts of experiences and problems that build the sort of skills cognitively that are tested by intelligence test scores. So we have really clear evidence that, contrary to the misuses in the past, that IQ isn't a fixed quantity biologically of a person, it's environmentally malleable. So given the kind of dangers of their misuse, why would we use them? And that's because they remain a really, really useful tool. They're useful for their original purpose, which is identifying children who are struggling in school and might need additional help, and also useful at identifying children who show a lot of academic promise who might otherwise be overlooked. So for instance, there's a great study out of North Carolina where they did universal IQ testing for all of their elementary school children, and they found that the number of low-income children and children of color in the gifted and talented program actually went up because teacher recommendations and parental nominations were biased against students who had less of those kind of resources to navigate the school system. So it predicts school performance, it predicts job performance, and it's a really important tool in studying cognitive aging and health. So what we see in lifespan studies, so studies that have followed people over the course of their whole lives, is that measurements of IQ in childhood don't just predict how well you do in school, but they predict how long you live and how healthy that lifespan is, even when you're comparing children who were raised in the same home and so had access to the same sort of socioeconomic resources in childhood. There's a couple different reasons why that might be. Some of it is that having higher intelligence test scores makes you go further in school, and especially in the US, schooling gets you access to health promoting resources, better jobs, more health insurance, safer, less toxic neighborhoods, access to better food. It's also true that some of the skills of intelligence, like memory, are health promoting. So you remember to take your medication on time. You are better able to understand complex instructions from your doctor. And it's also important to remember that we're bodies, and that includes your brain. And so part of intelligence is brain health, and that's going to be correlated with health in other bodily systems.